dirt, even in millions of ages. Now we see it, hear it, receive and maintain it. May we completely realize the Tathagata's true meaning. Good morning, everyone. Oh, wow, my voice just got big. Well, we'll take it. I'm Yugetsu. I'm a senior student here at Village Zendo. And I'm just really happy to be here with all of you. I'm impressed, it's the third day of session, and I'm impressed at how quickly we've all settled in. And yet, at the same time, I'm sure there's a lot coming up for people. And I know there is for me. There's always something unknown. You never know in any session where you're going to end up. And for me, this year, I'm ringing the Densho bell, which presents challenges because I have a hearing loss. And so I'm being asked to hear a bell that I really can't hear quite often because there are too many other things going on. And there's all these auditory reverberations going on. And so it asked me to sort of hear around the sound because I can't hear it. So I have to soften and listen for the signals of the sound. And that in itself has been a real teaching for me. And over the years, I've found that my patience, developing my patience, to look for and listen to these signals, not just to be all, in my mind, but to just be present, has been key to my settling in. And I'm especially aware of our newcomers who maybe haven't sat before and who have thrown themselves into this session. And I really want to encourage you to not suffer needlessly. Okay, there are many cushions back there, many different options for you to try. It's not supposed to be, pain isn't the point. Okay, the point is for you to find a position that you can hold for about a half an hour. And pain will come up sometimes, but you shouldn't be agonizing over it. And if you do find yourself in need of more instruction, the monitors are both really experienced in beginning instruction. They can help you. And for those who are leaving today, Village Zendo has beginning instruction on Mondays. You can come online. And our executive director, who teaches Feldenkrais, also teaches in person on the first Mondays of the month. First Sunday of the month, sorry. We'll teach in person where you can get real specific instructions. And for those leaving, the main thing is we hope you'll continue your practice. So this Anga, we're studying Dogen's instructions to the cook. And I was very pleased to hear about that because for me, it's a very meaningful text. I've always taken great solace in the very concrete instructions that he's giving us. In the earlier talks we had this week, Shinryu Roshi and Gesho both looked at this encounter that Dogen has on the ship when he's coming from Japan. And Japan has a different monastic tradition. Monks are basically fed like a cafeteria, basically, like you might feed livestock. You know, the food is just put out there, okay? So Dogen's arrived in China and he encounters this Tenzo, elderly Tenzo. And this encounter is somewhat baffling to Dogen because he's trying to get the Dogen to sit and talk and socialize. He's trying to get the Tenzo to do this, but the Tenzo has a job to do. And so he basically tells Dogen that he knows little about practice or words. And we'll continue this discussion later, basically. So Shinryu points to the fact that this confusion, the inquiring mind that Dogen feels is very much a part of our practice and very much something we should all soften around. And Gesho, in looking at the words, shows us how to pay attention. What are these words? What is this thusness being intimately conveyed with these words? In looking at Dogen's text, for me, it's notable how many of the instructions are just very kind of common sense. He says, put whatever goes to a high place in a high place, and whatever goes to a low place in a low place, so that high and low, everything settles in the place appropriate for it. He also talks about choosing utensils carefully, laying them out, keeping them clean. And the thing is, I'm struck by how much the legacy of women's care in the kitchen is really what he's talking about here, and what he's sort of codifying and exalting. And it deserves to be exalted. And he acknowledges it. He says, when we train in any of the offices of the monastery, we should do so with a joyful heart, a motherly heart, a vast heart. He goes on to say, a motherly heart is a heart which maintains the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, cares for these jewels as a parent cares for a child. This brought to its fullest is how you must care for water and rice as though they were your own children. In listening and reading this, I'm struck by how much it's very much like my mother's approach to these things. My mother taught me a lot about cooking, and she was very much like the Tenzo in that Dogen describes, the one who needs to supervise and do everything by themselves, for themselves. She wouldn't leave these tasks to anyone else. And later on, so I really didn't learn to cook from her. I really learned just by watching her example. And of course, not all mothers are great cooks, and for one reason, you know, they're absent from the kitchen, or maybe they're there and it's just not their forte. But what I am saying is that my mother was raised in a time of scarcity during the Great Depression, and she was raised in a tradition of Italian peasant women cooks who had to make do with scarce ingredients. And they needed to use everything that was at hand, all of the ingredients around them. She avoided throwing food out. She hated throwing food out. Waste not, want not. That was her mantra. And she was very strategic about how the ingredients were used throughout the week. More perishable things were cooked first. And we would run through the contents of her weekly shopping. And just like Dogen advises us not to discriminate about the desirability of different ingredients, she treated all ingredients with care. So I can say to you that, growing up with all of these great things, lasagna, manigotti with meatballs and baked eggplant, when I think of her cooking, that's not what I think of. What I think of is just a perfect string bean, just cooked so right, shimmering with a light vinaigrette and with flecks of parsley from the garden, like maybe a couple on it. And of course, the string bean I'm holding up right now is my string bean. Maybe you don't like string beans, or maybe you're seeing a different string bean, or you're kind of imagining what I'm talking about. It's not about possessiveness, this is my string bean. But for all of us here, the work we're doing, I think it's really about appreciating what's uniquely you. That's what we're clarifying here. In one of our study texts, I think it's a recommended one, I don't know if it was assigned, but perhaps the one this time that opened up most for me was Uchiyama Roshi's How to Cook Your Life. And he gives this great example of a cup that's between us, and how my view of this cup is very different. The light hitting it, the way I can see the water moving in it, it's different than yours. And it would be a mistake for us to entertain the idea that we're all seeing the same thing. He calls this mistake a fabrication of ideas. And he says, my true self lives in reality, and the world I experience is one I alone can experience, and not one anyone else can experience with me. To express this as precisely as possible, as I am born, I simultaneously give birth to the world I experience. I live out my life along with that world. And at my death, that world dies. The world I experience dies along with it. That example really touched me because, I grew up in a tradition where we're given an idea of heaven and that we'll be reunited. What he's saying here in terms of our practice is when we die, what is so uniquely us goes along with it. So it adds to the profundity of what we're doing here, of sitting with this great gift. Wherever you're seeing and whatever you're experiencing right now, it's up for us to care for and clarify our lives, to practice with the fire on our heads. And so I've approached this talk very much like I've approached putting together a meal, and that was the antipasto. And so what I'm serving up is more of Uchiyama Roshi. I was interested in finding out more about his life. His text spoke to me because it is very earthy and he is very honest, you know, about his own coming to awareness. He didn't have a privileged upbringing. He suffered from tuberculosis or symptoms of it for most of his life. And he ordained as a monk on December 8th, 1941. If any of you remember, that was the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So this is when he begins his practice as a monk, when Japan is engaged in a amazingly destructive war. Think about practicing in the chaos of that kind of war. It's hard to imagine a more challenging time. People were literally, in post-war, people were literally starving. And he had to figure out how to feed the people in the monastery. And so Dogen's instructions were extremely meaningful to him. He tells us the basic ingredient is none other than Zazen. Even in this chaos, the basic ingredient is Zazen. Our lives become vital when Zazen begins to function in our everyday activities. And he has an interesting insight into what Dogen describes as these wild horses and screaming monkeys that distract us during our Zazen. He reminds us that the mind is an organ, just like our stomachs. And just like our stomachs are secreting these juices that are causing all kinds of havoc during any sitting period, so your mind is secreting things. In the same way, the various secretions and hormones that flow through the organs of the body can be likened to the secretions of the mind. The most important thing to bear in mind when practicing Zazen is to completely let go of everyone, since secretion is nothing more than normal function. When we do that, everything that arises can be described as the scenery of our lives. And this has been described as the most fundamental appearances of things. So, this scenery of our lives, what he's talking about, what happens when these secretions subside and we have these moments? Lots of stuff comes up. Not all of it is pleasant. And this year, we have some really potent ingredients in there. It can seem really overwhelming. And for me, it's brought up a koan that I worked on many years ago when I was Shuso. Book of Serenity, Case 5, Xingyan and the Price of Rice. And this is the case. A monk asked Xingyan, "What is the great meaning of Buddhism?" Xingyan said, "What's the price of rice and luling?" So this monk is coming up to his teacher saying, "What's the great meaning here? What is the great meaning? What's the point?" And so Xingyan gives him, "What's the price of rice and luling?" These things matter. The price of rice and luling matters. You could say, what's the price of gas and eggs in Des Moines? holy shit, we just paid an awful lot for that. You could ask, what's the price of precious metal in Africa? What's the price of oil in Moscow? What's the price of an acre of land in any of the war-ravaged countries in the world? Good and bad flow with conditions. It's fluctuating, but you need to pay attention nonetheless, because these things matter. They are our ingredients. And when I look back over past crises and how I felt at the onset of it, I can see now, as I look back, that in the response, the ingredients were there. In the early 80s, that's when I came to New York in the East Village, and people were getting sick and dying, and they were dropping like flies, and it was really scary because no one gave a crap. People were being evicted from their apartments, chased out of grocery, gay men mostly, let's be specific here. Chased out of grocery stores, food was being left on trays outside of hospital rooms. And in this environment, a group of gay men came together to see what they could do. And they set up Gay Men's Health Crisis. And they realized they needed a hotline because nobody knew what was going on. And then they realized they needed buddies to go and take care of people who couldn't get out. And all of these ingredients came together, and people helped alleviate the suffering. And yet at a certain point, many of us who were doing this work had to ask ourselves, can we do more than just help people die? And so that's when a civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedient movement grew up. And we needed to address the root of the suffering. We needed to help people do more than die. So different questions came up, like, what's the price of a promising drug? So we got out in the street and asked that question and demanded an answer. It wasn't everybody's cup of tea. Some people preferred to do other things, to provide the help needed in the hospital, to call, to teach meditation at GMHC, which Roshi and Genshin Robert Savage did. But it was a time that required we used all the ingredients of our lives. In particular, at that time, we were a lot of queer people who were underemployed, and that was very valuable in terms of an ingredient. And so then there was this moment where the power really did have an effect. People started paying attention, and Anthony Fauci was listening and collaborating with us, and effective treatments did come along after many years. But like any strong ingredient, anger can start tearing apart a movement. And so then the energy dissipates, and people split off, and something else forms. Movements, in general, are like this. They do their work, and then they dissipate. They move on. And then it's time to clean the table, clean the utensils, and prepare for the next meal. And so, in the course of this talk, I've reached dessert. And I would say that while my mother was a good Tenzo, she couldn't bake for shit. And so it was the job of the guests to bring dessert. Everyone had to bring dessert. And so I'd like to end off with putting out a question right here, right now. What are you bringing to this meal? Because the ingredients are available around you. It's in the functioning of this retreat and the care people are taking of each other. It's in the ghosts that run around wild in these woods, the Lenape drying their pelts, the treason of Benedict Arnold as he ran around and escaped from this very cliff over here. It's from Hamilton, or it includes Hamilton Fish's opulent mansion that then became a school and is now rotting, just decaying, falling apart. It's all here. It's here in your zazen. It's one-stop shop. So let's be grateful for the meal that's offered. And I'm very much thinking about the lines we'll shortly chant, that we do eat to stop all suffering and to practice good and to accomplish our Buddha way.